The economic freedom fighters will celebrate the 11th anniversary in the Northern Cape on Saturday. The Red Berets lost seats in Parliament and in some legislatures across the country in the recent elections, which saw a new kid on the block, Umkhonto weSizwe Party, overtake the EFF to become the third biggest party in the country. Despite the party's poor performance in the polls, leader Julius Malema has expressed his readiness to lead the EFF for another term. Unisa's Professor in Political Science, Dirk Kotzé, joins us for more. Professor Dirk, always good to speak to you. Let's talk about the EFF and their impact on the political scene, and obviously the larger-than-life character of their leader in Julius Malema.
Yes, that is so. I think since the election of 2014, the EFF established a real presence at the national level, especially in Parliament. We've seen how many times they confronted President Zuma there, and that become, in a sense, their signature sort of approach, is that of protest, of challenging specifically President Zuma. And to a large extent, I think that has also led to the fact that they become so much associated with that they didn't develop the other components of a strong political party. Other forms of policy making, for example, that relied very much on the idea of resistance, of protest, and not necessarily developed all the components of an opposition, like, for example, alternative policy plans. Something like expropriation of land without compensation become another issue. But in Parliament, they became stuck in that with the ANC when they couldn't develop a common position with respect to the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution. And that is, to some extent, I would say, why we have seen with this election of 2024 at national and provincial level that the EFF actually lost some of its votes nationally with just close to 2% almost, but especially in KwaZulu-Natal. And that is where they were the hurt most in this election. And secondly, Gauteng. In some other provinces, 5 other provinces, they had actually some small increases, but that was not enough to prevent the national decline.
Political science professor at Unisa. Professor, good to have you back on the line. Before we lost you, my question to you was how much of the last 11 years of the EFF success do we attribute to Julius Malema? And more importantly, can he carry the EFF through to the new frontier?
Well, I think Julius Malema is the personification of the EFF. Without the EFF, they will lose a lot of their identity as a political party, and to a large extent also the appeal that it has to its members. At the same time, I think the question will be for how long can he still continue, because it can reach the point he is now there for 10 years already, the leader, that there will be some push for a new leadership, for a new dimension, because the EFF presents themselves as a party primarily aimed at the younger voters. They are very successful, for example, at universities to capture or to receive majorities in the elections for student representative councils, and they dominate most of them at most of the universities. So there is a very strong youth component to the party. And it will become more and more of a contradiction if the leaders continue and they become older and the same component of youthfulness is not seen within the leadership of the EFF. So it will ultimately become a question of how long will Julius Malema still be able to continue and to what extent he was able to cultivate a succession plan for new leaders to move forward.
Well, you speak of a succession plan. Now, how do you view the potential contest between Mbuyiseni Ndlozi and Marshall Dlamini for the Secretary General position? Does this speak to some growth or some democracy within the EFF?
Well, if that becomes a contest which is allowed to develop on its own and it is not manipulated by some of the top leadership in terms of who they pick as their favorite person for this position, then indeed it will become a matter of democratizing the EFF, because that is one of its big problems, is the fact that it is so centralized at the top. that it is very difficult for the different components of the EFF really to develop and develop their own characteristics, their own identity. Think, for example, to at most of the elections where some of these regional structures or provincial structures of the EFF were simply disbanded by the national leadership, and the vacuum in some instances developed. I can think about here in Tshwane with the 2021 election. Just before the local government election, they dissolved the total structure of the EFF, and there was nothing to replace that. Now, that is the type of problems that is caused by over-centralization of a party. And those are the things that the EFF will have to address in order to be able to have a wider appeal. I think this over-centralization has become well known across the board, and that attracts persons for a short while, but not to stay in the EFF for a very long period. What's very significant and unique about the EFF is that some of my colleagues have done good research about it, is that the EFF is the party where there's the most of movement between new members or new supporters coming in, but at the same time losing the most of their existing supporters. So the core in the middle is actually very small compared to some of the other parties. And that is what they will have to change in order to become a more sustainable party and growing party for the future.
Prof, you raise the issue there of sustainability. And can we draw parallels between the EFF and any parties here in South Africa that started off similarly but graduated into a more democratic organization that wasn't about one or two individuals, but that allowed many others to build a core and drive the political party, either in this country or elsewhere on the African continent?
Well, South Africa don't have good examples at the moment of that. Countries, parties like, for example, the IFP for decades have been dominated by Prince Buthelezi. The DA, one can maybe argue that there is now more of an openness about leadership. There was a time when Helen Zille very much dominated it, but since she moved out, I think there's more rotation within the leadership, not necessarily only the top leadership, but leadership at different levels within the DA. I would say some of the other parties are actually very small, and that makes it very difficult for rotation. Take something, a party like the UDM, for example. President General Unisa is absolutely dominant. He is the party to a large extent. It looks like Action SA is to a large extent still also in that position with Herbert Mashaba. So it's for parties, on the other hand, in the past, there were parties like AZAPU, where there was almost a constant rotation of leadership, and that led also to a lack of continuity in that party. So a fine balance must be found between leadership for some time, but that there are ultimately rotation, and that it's not there for too long, but that also that there's not too much of a rotation, and that the party does not develop the identity around a specific leadership.
All right, now, we can't really talk about the EFF celebrating 11 years without bringing in the VBS scandal and the implications for the party's reputation.
Yes, that is indeed, I think, will be a major test for the EFF. If it comes to the point where there will actually be persons' leadership, especially Julius Malema and Floyd Shivambu, if they are charged in court, and if it becomes a point where there's serious evidence against them, that will be, I would say, an existential crisis for the EFF, because they are at this stage the core of the EFF to a large extent. An EFF without Julius Malema and Floyd Shivambu is very difficult to imagine at this point in time. And I think if it does materialize like that, because there is not a natural third and fourth person who might be able to take over that position, I think that will cause a bit of a leadership vacuum and maybe a leadership contest that will be detrimental to the party.
Professor Fani, what are the EFF's priorities, do you think, moving forward? How do they plan to achieve their goals?
Yeah, that's something I think that all of us are asking of exactly what will be the strategy. They are now firmly in the opposition benches together with the MK party. They have been pushed aside by the ANC in some of the coalitions, especially in the metros in Gauteng. So they are where they've been to some extent still within the governing environment. They are losing that at the moment. So in that sense, I think the question will be is how are they going to position themselves as an opposition party? They've indicated, especially Julius Malema, that they are going to be a so-called more respected opposition, that they are not going to do the same as in the past in Parliament, disrupting the proceedings of Parliament. So if that is the case, because that has become, in a sense, a signature of the EFF, is that protest politics, then is the question, how are they going to approach it? One of their very important policy focus areas is land issues. But now in the Government of National Unity, the land issue has been handed over to the PAC. And the PAC can claim the status as the political party who has the longest history and is the most authentic when it comes to the land issue. So that creates a problem for the EFF to claim that they are actually the leading party on that issue of land matters and redistribution and expropriation. So I think this poses a major question for the EFF. Where do they want to go to? Because what we have seen from the election results is that the real left, the left of the ANC, is actually very small. And that has always been the case in South Africa. The center left is much bigger than the left, the real or the more radical left. And all the parties in that area have not performed at all. So that is not for the EFF, the real area in which they can go into in order to grow as a political party. So then the question is, where do they want to move? Closer to that of the ANC, and by implication, even the DA, or where the Government of National Unity will be ultimately after all their policy developments. And then the question will be what makes the EFF different from these other parties. So it is essentially quite a headache that they have.
Is the MK party also a headache in the eyes or on the agenda of the EFF, particularly because the EFF was the third largest party going into the May 29 elections. They expected to maintain that position. In fact, their argument was they would be the official opposition post-election. That didn't happen. The MK party came up and usurped that position. Are they strategizing around this?
Well, I guess so. And I mentioned earlier on that that's where the EFF lost a lot of their votes, possibly the most of their votes, is in KwaZulu-Natal. And that is where the EFF came in direct competition with MK. Not in provinces like, for example, Mpumalanga, where the EFF actually grew with about 1%, or the other province where they were confronted by MK was here in Gauteng. I think where the EFF differs from MK is that MK is a regional party. It's a party where by far the majority of its support is concentrated in KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumalanga, and the 9% in Gauteng. While the EFF, they must receive credit for it that they have support in all the provinces. The one where they are the weakest is the Western Cape. There they also increased their support with 1% in this election, but at a very low level. But otherwise, they are much more spread across South Africa than the MK party. But they don't have the same concentration as the MK in KwaZulu-Natal. Gauteng is the main province for the EFF. That's where they receive the majority of their votes. But the point is, the Gauteng is such a contested province that there is no real growth potential for the EFF anymore. So the only way is for them to start to look at other provinces. And again, that I think is their challenge, because there is, in a sense, a disconnect between how they present themselves in ideological terms as they call it a Marxist-Leninist party based on the ideas of Frans Fanon, but in reality, they are more of a centrist party or centrist left party. And their support is amongst the students and very often persons who are in urban areas, almost in a more of a middle class position. So I think that is the disconnect that exists between its policies and ideologies and those who support them.
Professor Dirk Kotzé, political science professor at Unisa, unpacking for us that conversation.